The first thing Daniel Whitfield registered, upon waking up inside a body that was not entirely his own, was the taste of Cabernet Sauvignon sliding down his throat the wrong way. The second thing he registered was that the glass in his hand was tipping, in slow and merciless motion, directly toward the crisp white dress shirt of the largest, most humorless-looking man Daniel had ever seen in his life. There was no time to think about how he had gone from falling asleep at 1 a.m. Scrolling through a web novel titled The Omega Who Deserved, better to standing in a dining room with crown molding and a chandelier the size of a Buick. There was only time to watch, in horror, as an entire glass of red wine baptized the front of William Ashford's shirt. The table went silent, 12 place settings worth of silence, thick as the Spanish moss Daniel could see swaying outside the tall windows. Candlelight flickered off crystal and silver, off the pale, disapproving faces turned in his direction, off the dark, spreading stain now soaking into a shirt that had probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent in whatever life he'd just left behind. "Oh my God," Daniel said, which he would later realize was not something the original Daniel, sweet, soft-spoken, endlessly apologetic Daniel, would ever have said at his own engagement dinner. "Oh my God, I am so sorry, that is a lot of wine, isn't it? On you, I mean on your shirt, which was white, and is now not white." He was babbling, both hands fluttering uselessly in the air, like he could somehow wave the wine back into the glass. He knew perfectly well he was babbling. He could not stop. William Ashford did not move. He was the kind of still that predators were still, a stillness that had weight to it, that pressed on the air. He was broad through the shoulders in the way of men who worked with their hands, even though everyone at this table clearly hadn't worked with their hands a day in their gilded lives. His jaw was the sort of sharp that photographed well and intimidated better. And his eyes, pale gray, like the sky over the harbor before a storm, were fixed on Daniel with an expression Daniel could not read at all. Then, low enough that only Daniel could hear it, William said, "You've been trying to get out of this dinner since 3 o'clock this afternoon. I didn't realize you'd resort to assassination by Cabernet." Daniel blinked. Was that a joke?" Before Daniel could recover, William's mother, a silver-haired woman in a Chanel suit who introduced herself, with the warmth of a glacier, as Margaret Ashford, and you may call me Mrs. Ashford, cleared her throat. "Daniel, dear," Margaret said, in a voice that suggested this was not the first humiliation she had catalogued that evening. "Perhaps you'd like to help William find a fresh shirt." It was Daniel understood immediately, not a suggestion. It was a woman ejecting an inconvenience from her dining room with the elegance of a hostess and the ruthlessness of a general. William rose without a word, 6'3" of expensive tailoring and quiet irritation, and Daniel, flushing, mortified, clutching a wine-damp cloth napkin like a shield, followed him out of the dining room and into a hallway lined with oil portraits of Ashfords, who had, presumably, never once spilled anything on anyone in their entire dignified lives. "I really am sorry," Daniel said to William's retreating back. "I don't know what happened. My hand it slipped." William stopped at the foot of a curved staircase. He turned, and for one unguarded second, something flickered across his face that was not annoyance at all. It looked almost like relief. "Don't apologize," William said. "That's the first honest thing that's happened at one of my mother's dinners in 3 years." And then, before Daniel could ask what on earth that meant, William unbuttoned the ruined shirt right there in the hallway, revealing a stretch of collarbone and a body that had clearly never skipped a single day at the gym, and Daniel's brain, already reeling from the fact that he had apparently transmigrated into a gay Omegaverse romance novel as the male lead's fiancé, simply short-circuited. This is fine, Daniel thought, staring resolutely at a painting of somebody's ancestor. This is completely fine. I have not just woken up engaged to a walking Ralph Lauren advertisement. Everything is fine. Somewhere behind him, William laughed, a short, surprised huff of a sound, like he hadn't meant to, and Daniel had the distinct, dizzying sense that his entire life had just changed, and he had absolutely no idea whether that was a disaster or the best thing that had ever happened to him. It took Daniel exactly 4 hours, alone in an unfamiliar guest room with a 4-poster bed that probably cost more than his old apartment's annual rent, to piece together where and who he was. He was Daniel Whitfield, 26. An Omega, orphaned young, raised by an aunt who'd married into old Charleston money and never let him forget it. He had grown up in the shadow of his glittering, ambitious cousin Charles Vane, and 6 months ago, in a whirlwind that the tabloids had called the merger of the century, he had gotten engaged to William Ashford, heir to Ashford Maritime, the shipping empire that had quietly run half the port of Charleston since before the Civil War. And Daniel knew all of this, knew the wedding date, knew the names of the bridesmaids, knew that there was a scene in 3 weeks' time where everything fell apart, because he had read it. 6 months ago, in his old life, at 2 in the morning, he had read the Omega Who Deserved Better from the first chapter to the last 112 chapters of heartbreak, dressed up as a Southern Gothic romance. He was inside the book now. He was the Omega who had not, in fact, deserved better, because in the original story, sweet, trusting Daniel Whitfield had gone to his own wedding at the Ashford family's restored plantation house on the Ashley River, and during the cocktail hour, before a single vow had even been spoken, the Ashford engagement ring, a ring with 130 years of family history stitched into its setting, insured for an amount that made Daniel's stomach hurt just thinking about it, had vanished from the antique box where it had been displayed for guests. And Charles Vane, sweet-faced, silver-tongued Charles, had been the one to discover it missing, had been the one to suggest, so gently, so reluctantly, that perhaps Daniel, desperate, poor, grasping Daniel, had sold it, had planted. Daniel now remembered with a cold jolt down his spine, a pawnshop receipt in Daniel's coat pocket that would be found at the worst possible moment. William had believed it. That was the part that had kept Daniel up reading until dawn in his old life, furious at a fictional man for a fictional betrayal. William had looked at his own fiancée with those storm-gray eyes gone flat and cold, and he had called off the wedding in front of 200 guests, and Daniel Whitfield, the original one, had spent the rest of the book trying and failing to prove he wasn't a thief, while Charles quietly inherited the trust and the sympathy, and eventually William's guilt-ridden friendship. Not this time, Daniel thought, sitting up so fast the room spun. He had 3 weeks. He had a body that wasn't his, a fiancée who was, by all accounts, supposed to be a cold, unfeeling business machine, and had instead laughed, actually laughed, in a hallway 2 hours ago. And he had a cousin who was, at this very moment, somewhere in this city, quietly assembling the pieces of a lie that would destroy an innocent man's life. Daniel looked down at his own shaking hands. Okay, he thought. Okay, first things first. Don't get caught staring at William's collarbones. Second, figure out how to stop a heist before it happens. A knock sounded at the door. When Daniel opened it, William stood in the hallway in a fresh Henley, hair still damp from a shower, looking almost boyish in a way that didn't match the granite jawline at all. You didn't come back down for dessert, William said. My mother assumes you fled the state. I got a little overwhelmed, Daniel admitted, which was, for once, the complete truth. William studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that made Daniel feel like he was being read, page by page, by someone unfairly good at it. You've been different today, William said finally, not accusing. Just observing, the way you'd note a change in the weather. Shopper. Braver about the wine thing, for one. Daniel's heart stuttered. Is that bad? Something shifted in William's expression, something that softened the hard lines of it. No, he said, quiet enough that it landed somewhere under Daniel's ribs, and stayed there. No, I don't think it's bad at all. He held out a small paper bag. Daniel took it, baffled, and found inside a single slice of the dessert he'd missed. Bourbon pecan pie, still faintly warm, wrapped with more care than a man who supposedly ran a shipping empire with an iron fist had any business putting into contraband pie. You hate leaving a room hungry, William said, already turning to go, like he hadn't just done something devastatingly sweet. Even when you're too polite to say so. Daniel stood in the doorway holding a slice of pie in a paper bag, watching William Ashford's retreating back for the second time that day, and thought, with the sinking, thrilling certainty of a man in far too deep, oh no, I am not ready for this book to break my heart in real life. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a crash course Daniel had never signed up for. He learned that Ashford Maritime employed 11,000 people across 4 ports, and that William ran it with a competence that had nothing to do with the cold machine reputation the book had given him, and everything to do with the fact that he simply didn't waste words on people who hadn't earned them. He learned that William took his coffee black except on Sundays, when he let himself have cream, like sweetness was a rule he only allowed himself once a week. He learned that the dog, an enormous drooling mastiff named Biscuit that the book had never once mentioned, belonged entirely to William, and that William talked to Biscuit in a voice Daniel had never once heard him use on a human being, low and fond and a little ridiculous. He learned, mostly by trial and error, how to be a version of Daniel Whitfield that felt like himself, quicker-tongued, less apologetic, prone to teasing, without breaking whatever fragile trust the original Daniel had built with the people around him. He learned the small, specific textures of a life that wasn't quite his own yet. The particular creak of the third porch step on Trad Street, always underfoot before you expected it, the way the harbor smelled different depending on the tide, brine and diesel in the mornings, something sweeter and greener by evening when the marsh grass exhaled the day's heat back into the air, the low, contented rumble of Biscuit's snore drifting up through the floorboards at night, a strange comfort in an unfamiliar house. Charleston in early spring was loud with cicadas and hush with old money at the same time, and Daniel found himself falling for the city almost as helplessly as he was falling for the man who lived in it, and he learned, with a helpless, sinking clarity that grew by the day, that he was falling for his own fiancée. It happened in increments too small to name. In the way William started arriving 20 minutes early to pick him up from his design studio. Daniel, it turned out, restored historic wallpaper for a living, a detail the book had mentioned exactly once, and Daniel now found devastatingly charming about his own circumstances, just to sit in the car and watch him work through the window, like he couldn't stand to lose the 20 minutes. In the way William's hand found the small of Daniel's back at parties, not possessive, just present, like an anchor. In the way William, 3 days after the wine incident, showed up with a folder of contractors who specialized in 18th century wallpaper restoration, because Daniel had mentioned once, offhand, that he wished Charleston had more of them. "You remembered that," Daniel had said, staring at the folder like it might combust. "I remember most things you say," William had answered like it wasn't a confession at all, and then looked faintly annoyed at himself for saying it. It was on the 10th day, a Tuesday humid and gold with late afternoon light, that Daniel finally understood the shape of what he was feeling. They were on the porch of William's house on Trad Street, an 1820 single house with a walled garden and a porch swing that creaked in a way that should have been annoying and instead felt like music. Biscuit was sprawled across both their feet like a hairy, snoring ottoman. William had his sleeves rolled up, a legal pad balanced on one knee, working through some contract while Daniel sketched wallpaper patterns beside him, and neither of them was talking, and it was, Daniel realized with a jolt, the most comfortable silence he had ever sat in with another person in either of his lives. "You're staring," William said, without looking up. "I'm sketching. You're staring at me and calling it sketching." Daniel's face went hot. "Maybe I'm sketching you." That got William's attention. He looked over, one eyebrow raised, something warm and dangerous playing at the corner of his mouth. "Let's see it then." "Absolutely not. Daniel, it's a terrible drawing, you'd be offended." William plucked the sketchbook clean out of his hands before Daniel could stop him, and Daniel lunged, and Biscuit woke up with an offended snort as both men tumbled sideways on the porch swing, laughing, William's arm coming up automatically to catch Daniel before he hit the floorboards. And for one long, suspended second they were tangled together, William's hand splayed warm against Daniel's back, their faces close enough that Daniel could count the small scar through William's left eyebrow that the book had never once described because the book had never once bothered to look at him this closely. "Hi," William said, low, and something about the word, so simple, so unlike him, made Daniel's chest ache. "Hi," Daniel managed back. Neither of them moved to untangle. Biscuit, thoroughly unbothered by romance, went back to sleep across their ankles. "I wasn't going to let this be real," William said quietly, like he was admitting to something. "This, whatever this is. I told myself I was marrying you for the merger, that it didn't have to mean anything more than paperwork. It was easier that way." His thumb moved, once, against Daniel's spine, absent and unconscious. "I don't think I believe that anymore." Daniel's throat went tight. 20 minutes early. The pecan pie. The contractor's folder. A man who did not waste words on people who hadn't earned them, spending every one of his words on Daniel anyway. "I don't want it to just be paperwork either," Daniel said, and it came out steadier than he felt, which was, he thought, its own kind of miracle. William didn't kiss him, not yet. He just looked at Daniel for a long moment, gray eyes gone soft as harbor fog, and pressed his mouth briefly, deliberately, to Daniel's forehead, a promise instead of a demand, and said, "Good," like the single syllable settled something enormous. It was, Daniel would think later, the moment the book had never written, the moment nobody had told him to expect. The exact second he stopped being a passenger in someone else's tragedy and started, however unsteadily, building something of his own. It was Thomas Ashford, 31, dry-witted, and Daniel had quickly learned, entirely without shame when it came to embarrassing his cousin, who introduced the concept of the Ashford Family Regatta, an annual charity sailing race down the Ashley River that raised money for the local children's hospital, and more importantly, as far as Thomas was concerned, gave him an excuse to heckle William in front of an audience. "He's captained the family boat for 6 years running," Thomas informed Daniel, sotto voce, over mimosas on the museum lawn the Saturday before the race. "Won every single time. It's insufferable. He gets this look on his face, very serious, very captain of industry, like he's negotiating a merger instead of sailing a 22-foot sloop past the Coast Guard station." "I don't have a look," William said, from 3 feet away, not glancing up from the rigging he was inspecting with the focus of a surgeon. "You absolutely have a look," Thomas said. "Daniel, you'll see it. It's the same face he makes reading maritime insurance contracts, deeply, tragically serious." Daniel, delighted, filed this information away with the reverence of a man collecting evidence for future teasing. "Can I sail with you?" That got William's attention. He looked up, something wary and hopeful warring in his expression. "You get seasick," he said. "You told me that at the museum gala. You said, and I quote, 'Boats and I have an understanding, and the understanding is that I stay on land.'" "I lied," Daniel said cheerfully. "I wanted to seem interesting and low maintenance on our 3rd date. You spilled an entire glass of wine on me the night we got engaged." "That was an accident. This is strategy." William's mouth twitched, fighting a smile and losing. "Fine, but if you throw up on my boat, I'm having the whole thing repainted and telling everyone it was biscuit." "Deal," Daniel said, and stuck out his hand to shake on it, and William, solemn, formal, ridiculous, shook it like they were closing an actual business transaction, and then didn't let go for a full 10 seconds longer than the handshake strictly required, and Daniel decided he could live with a great many indignities if it meant more moments exactly like this one. The race itself was, predictably, a disaster in the most charming possible way. Daniel knew nothing about sailing beyond what he'd absorbed from a single viewing of a pirate movie in middle school, and he spent the first 15 minutes enthusiastically pulling on ropes William hadn't asked him to touch, which resulted in the boom swinging directly toward William's head with enough force that he had to duck, wineglass incident style, for the 2nd time in their short relationship. "I didn't do that on purpose," Daniel said, wide-eyed, as William surfaced from underneath the sail looking personally betrayed by physics. "I'm aware," William said, breathless with something that might have been irritation, and might, Daniel suspected, have actually been laughter he refused to let out. "Please, sit down. Don't touch anything. I mean it, Daniel. Hands in your lap. You're bossy on a boat. I'm bossy because my fiancée is trying to decapitate me with sailing equipment." Daniel sat, chastened, hands folded primly in his lap like a scolded child, and lasted approximately 4 minutes before he was leaning over the side to trail his fingers in the cool green water, laughing at something Thomas's boat shouted across the gap between them, sunburned and salt-sprayed and happier than he could remember being in longer than he wanted to admit. They lost the race, spectacularly. Thomas's boat crossed the finish line 11 minutes ahead of them, and Thomas stood at the bow the entire final stretch, arms raised in premature victory, shouting something about 6 years of tyranny finally broken that carried clear across the water. William took the loss with the wounded dignity of a man whose entire self-image had briefly depended on maritime supremacy. "This is your fault," he informed Daniel, tying off the last line at the dock with more force than strictly necessary. "You cost me the regatta, I cost you nothing." I sat very quietly and admired the scenery. "You admired the scenery while unclipping the jib sheet. Twice. I was curious what it did." "It did that," William said, gesturing at the general chaos of the last hour, and then, betraying himself completely, broke into a grin he clearly hadn't meant to let out, helpless and boyish and nothing at all like the cold, unreadable air the whole of Charleston seemed to think they knew. You're a menace, a genuine menace. I've lost 6 years of unbroken victory to a man who doesn't know port from starboard." Around them, the dock had emptied out into the golden hour of late afternoon, the smell of salt and diesel, and someone's grilling shrimp drifting over from the yacht club patio, gulls wheeling low over the pilings in search of dropped hors d'oeuvres. "And yet," Daniel said, stepping close, salt-damp and sun-warm and utterly unbothered, "you're smiling like it's the best afternoon you've had all year." William's hands found Daniel's waist, steadying him against the gentle rock of the dock beneath their feet. "It might be," he admitted, quiet now, the teasing falling away into something softer. 6 years of winning never felt like this. "Like what?" "Like something worth losing for," William said, and Daniel, half lawing, half undone, decided that he would happily lose every regatta for the rest of his life if it meant collecting more evenings exactly like this one, sunburned, salt-sprayed, and thoroughly, hopelessly in love with a man the book had never once bothered to describe laughing. Daniel met Charles Vane properly for the first time, the second time, if you counted the vague déjà vu of the original Daniel's memories, at a fundraiser for the Charleston Maritime Museum, held in a ballroom with a ceiling painted like a summer sky and a string quartet playing something that sounded expensive. He would have known Charles anywhere. The book had described him accurately, at least. Golden-haired, disarmingly handsome, with the kind of smile that made strangers trust him within 30 seconds and made Daniel's skin crawl within 5. Charles Vane, 29. Daniel's first cousin on his mother's side, raised 2 streets over in a house with a smaller lawn and a bigger grudge. That was how the book had introduced him back in Chapter 2. In a single clipped paragraph Daniel had read at 2 in the morning, without once suspecting he would someday have to stand across a ballroom from the man himself and feel his pulse spike at the sight of that same practiced smile. In the novel, Charles had always seemed almost sympathetic, a striver overlooked, reaching for what he thought he deserved. In person, under gilded chandeliers, that sympathy evaporated fast. There was something in the way Charles held a room, angling his body just slightly toward whoever mattered most and away from whoever didn't, that made Daniel's skin prickle with a wariness no book had prepared him for. "Danny," Charles said, kissing his cheek before Daniel could step back. "Look at you, practically glowing. Marriage agrees with you already, cousin, and you're not even married yet." "Charles." Daniel kept his voice pleasant with an effort that cost him. "I didn't know you'd be here." "I'm on the museum board now," Charles said, with the modest little shrug of a man who was not remotely modest. "Someone has to keep an eye on the family's philanthropic legacy, now that you're marrying into all this." His gaze slid, briefly, meaningfully, toward William, who was deep in conversation with a state senator across the room. "It really is remarkable, isn't it? How far you've come. I remember when you couldn't afford your own apartment. There it was. The needle slid in soft as silk." In the book, this was the moment original Daniel had flushed and apologized for existing. Daniel. The Daniel currently occupying this body, 3 weeks wiser and considerably less inclined to apologize, smiled instead, wide and easy. "I remember that too," he said. "I also remember you asking to borrow money that same year and never paying it back. Isn't memory a wonderful thing?" Something flickered behind Charles's eyes, surprise quickly smoothed over, but Daniel had seen it, a crack in the golden mask. "You've gotten mouthy," Charles said, softer now, and the softness was worse than the smile had been. "I've gotten married," Daniel corrected. "Wellmost. A week and a half." "A week and a half," Charles repeated, and smiled again, and this time the smile didn't reach his eyes at all. "How exciting. Nearly here already. I do hope everything goes according to plan." He drifted off into the crowd before Daniel could answer, and Daniel stood there with his heart hammering because he recognized that sentence. He had read it, word for word almost, from chapter 41 of a book he'd thought he would never have to live through. "I do hope everything goes according to plan." Charles's plan, the pawnshop receipt, the ring. Daniel found William's hand in the crowd, without quite deciding to, and William, mid-sentence with the senator, glanced down at their joined hands and then up at Daniel's face, and whatever he saw there made him excuse himself immediately. "What happened?" William said, low, steering them both toward a quieter corner near the tall windows. "Nothing," Daniel said, and then, because he had promised himself 3 weeks ago that this time he would not simply endure his own destruction in silence, "Actually, no." Something, can we talk? Not here. Somewhere private. William's jaw tightened, not with irritation. Daniel was learning to read him now, the small vocabulary of a man who felt enormous things and expressed almost none of them out loud, but with something closer to worry. "Tonight," William said. "My study. I'll get us out of here in 20 minutes." He was as good as his word. 22 minutes later, they were in the leather and brass quiet of William's study on Trad Street, Biscuit snoring at the foot of the desk. And Daniel was pacing in front of the fireplace, trying to figure out how to explain a premonition without explaining that he'd transmigrated into a gay Omegaverse novel from his old life's phone. "My cousin," Daniel said finally, "is planning to do something at the wedding. Something with the ring." William went very still. "What kind of something?" "I don't have proof yet," Daniel admitted, which was true. He had a novel's worth of plot instead of proof, and that was a much harder thing to explain to a man staring at you like you'd just handed him the second half of a sentence he'd been dreading his whole life. "But I think he's going to make it look like I stole it, sold it. He's going to plant evidence, something like a pawn shop receipt, and let it be discovered during the reception, when everyone's watching, when it'll do the most damage." He braced himself. This was the moment in the book where William had believed Charles instead, where 3 years of quiet, careful family loyalty to a golden cousin had outweighed 6 months of engagement to a nobody Omega with no name behind him. William was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the room, took both of Daniel's hands in his, steady, deliberate grounding, and said, "Tell me why you think that. Everything. Don't leave anything out because you're worried I won't believe you." And Daniel, looking up into those storm-gray eyes that were watching him like he was the only true thing in the room, felt something in his chest crack open with relief. This time, Daniel thought, he's going to choose me first. It took Daniel 2 days to convince William that his instincts about Charles were worth acting on, and it took William exactly 6 hours after that to have a private investigator's preliminary report on his desk, because, as Daniel was rapidly discovering, a man who ran a shipping empire spanning 4 ports did not, in fact, sit around waiting for evidence to fall into his lap. 3 withdrawals, William said, spreading photographs and bank statements across the study desk like a general laying out a battle map, from Charles's personal account to a pawn shop on King Street over the last month, small enough not to raise flags on their own. "But look here," he tapped a printout. "He's been asking questions about our ring's insurance appraisal, called the family's insurer twice, claiming he was helping plan a surprise for you. The insurer didn't think twice about it. Charles's family, after all." Daniel's stomach turned over. It was exactly as the book had described, except this time he wasn't reading about it 3 weeks after the damage was already done. He was standing in a warm, lamplit study with the man he loved, watching a trap get dismantled before it could close. "So what do we do?" Daniel asked. "Go to the police? Confront him?" "No." William's mouth curved, not with amusement exactly, but with something sharper. The particular satisfaction of a man who had built an empire by being 3 moves ahead of everyone who underestimated him. If we confront him now, he denies everything, destroys the receipt he's planning to plant, and tries again some other way, some other day. We need him to actually try it, in front of witnesses, with no room left to lie his way out. That sounds like a plan. Daniel said slowly, "That requires the ring to actually be there to steal." "Yes. And you're comfortable with that? Risking a 130-year-old family heirloom to catch your cousin-in-law red-handed?" William was quiet for a moment, turning one of the photographs over in his hands. "My grandmother wore that ring for 61 years, he said finally. "She used to say a ring like that was only ever really worth something if the marriage behind it was honest, that the stone didn't matter half as much as the hands it passed between." He looked up at Daniel, and there was something almost raw in his expression, something the cold machine reputation had never once let show. "I'd rather lose the ring than lose the chance to prove, in front of everyone who's ever doubted you, that you were never the problem. That's worth more to me than any stone." Daniel had to look away, blinking hard, because if he looked at William's face for one more second, he was going to cry in the middle of a very serious criminal conspiracy planning session, and that felt like it would undercut the mood. "I have an idea," Daniel said instead, once he'd gotten his voice steady, pacing a slow, thoughtful circle in front of the fireplace while the plan assembled itself, piece by piece, in his head. "But it means the ring can't be there at all. Not a decoy, not a fake. Nothing for him to plant evidence against, because there's nothing for him to have supposedly stolen. William raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. Go on. The Charleston Maritime Museum, Daniel said. The one Charles is so proud of sitting on the board of. What if, 3 days before the wedding, you and I donate the ring to their permanent collection? Publicly. Announced in the paper, everything. The Ashford family heirloom, generously gifted to the people of Charleston, to be displayed alongside the maritime history it's part of. 130 years of provenance, tied to your family's shipping legacy. It's a museum piece as much as it's a wedding ring. We wear replicas at the ceremony, cubic zirconia, nobody but us, and maybe your mother the wiser. And when Charles shows up at the reception to discover the real ring missing, so he can point his manufactured evidence at me. There's nothing there to discover, William finished, and something lit up in his face that Daniel had never seen before. Not the careful warmth he showed Daniel alone, not the guarded courtesy he showed his mother's dinner guests, but something bright and delighted and almost boyish. He'll have spent a month building a lie with no crime behind it. He'll stand up in front of 200 people, including 3 museum board members, who watched us make the donation, and accuse you of stealing a ring that's sitting under glass at the Maritime Museum a mile and a half away. Everyone will see him lie, Daniel said quietly, with absolutely nothing to back it up. William laughed, really laughed, head tipped back, the sound filling the study, and then he crossed the room and kissed Daniel for the first time. Hard and sure and long overdue, one hand cradling the back of Daniel's neck like he was something precious, and Daniel melted into it, into him, 3 weeks and 1 lifetime's worth of longing, finally landing somewhere solid. I love you, William said against his mouth, sounding faintly stunned by his own honesty. God help me, Daniel, I think I have for weeks. I love you too, Daniel whispered back, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in either of his lives. There was one more person who needed to know before the plan could move forward, and William insisted on telling her himself, his mother. Margaret Ashford listened to the whole plan in her study on Laguerre Street 2 days later, seated ramrod straight in a wingback chair, a cup of tea going cold, untouched, at her elbow. When William finished, she was quiet for a long, unreadable moment. The same glacial stillness Daniel remembered from that first, disastrous dinner 3 weeks earlier. I always thought Charles was too charming for his own good, she said finally, setting the teacup down with a click that carried more judgment than any raised voice could have. His mother spoiled him terribly. I should have said something years ago. She turned to Daniel then, and something in her expression, still formal, still precise, but no longer cold, caught him off guard. You handled that dinner better than I gave you credit for at the time, Daniel. I underestimated you. I don't intend to make that mistake again. It was not quite an apology. From Margaret Ashford, Daniel understood. It was as close to one as he was ever likely to get, and it was, unexpectedly, enough. She insisted on one addition to the plan before she left, that the museum donation be framed publicly, as a joint Ashford family gesture rather than simply William and Daniel's idea, her own name listed quietly among the sponsors. If Charles wants to test how far family loyalty stretches, she said, rising and gathering her gloves with brisk, decisive movements, he ought to learn where mine actually lands. It was never going to be with him. She paused at the study door, and for just a moment the glacial composure cracked into something almost gentle. Welcome to the family, Daniel. Properly, this time. The announcement ran in the Charleston Post and Courier 4 days before the wedding, above the fold in the Sunday Style section. Asked Ford, family gifts, historic engagement ring to Merida Museum, alongside a photograph of William and Daniel standing before a glass display case, hands clasped, the ring nestled on a bed of velvet beneath a small brass plaque that read Gift of William Ashford and Daniel Whitfield, in celebration of their marriage and in service of Charleston's maritime heritage. The press conference itself had been held on the museum's front steps, overlooking the harbor, with a scatter of reporters and a local news crew angling for the shot of William's hand settling, warm and certain, over Daniel's on the display case glass. The museum director had cried actual tears, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue someone's assistant had produced with almost military efficiency. 3 board members had shaken Daniel's hand and told him, with real warmth, how remarkable a gesture it was. One had even called it, a little breathlessly, the most generous thing this institution has seen in a decade. Charles Vane had stood at the edge of the small crowd, arms crossed loosely, a smile frozen so tightly to his face that Daniel had nearly felt sorry for him. Nearly. "You didn't tell me about this," Charles said afterward, cornering Daniel by the coat check, voice pitched low and pleasant for the benefit of anyone listening. "Rather sudden, wasn't it? Giving away the ring right before the wedding." "William's idea, mostly," Daniel said, which was a lie so smooth it surprised him. "Though I loved it the second he suggested it. It felt right. A ring like that deserves to mean something bigger than just us." "How generous," Charles said. His eyes were doing the math. Daniel could see it happening in real time. The calculation of a man watching his careful weeks of preparation crumble in front of him, trying to find another angle, another lie to build. "I'm sure it'll be a lovely piece for people to look at. Shame no one gets to actually wear it, though." "We have replicas for the ceremony," Daniel said, holding his cousin's gaze, steady as he'd never once been in the original version of this story. "Perfect copies. Nobody will ever know the difference just by looking." Something in Charles's expression cracked just slightly, just for a second, and Daniel understood, with a cold clarity, that his cousin had already begun quietly planning what he would do with the pawnshop receipt regardless. That the plan had gone too far to abandon, that Charles was the kind of man who would rather set a fire in an empty house than admit the house had already burned down around him. "Well," Charles said, smile snapping back into place like a mask clicking shut, "I suppose I'll see you both at the wedding then. I do hope everything goes smoothly." He walked away, threading back into the crowd with the easy, practiced grace of a man who had never once been told no, and Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and thought, he's still going to try it. He doesn't even know how to stop. He found William's hand again. He was getting rather good at finding William's hand these days, in crowds, in doorways, in quiet moments that needed steadying, and told him everything. "Good," William said, unbothered, dropping a kiss to Daniel's temple right there by the coat check where anyone could see. "Let him try. Let him stand up in front of the whole city and make a fool of himself. Some men only ever learn the truth the hard way." The wedding took place on a Saturday in April at Ashford Landing, the family's restored plantation-turned-event venue on the Ashley River, its live oaks draped in Spanish moss, its lawn rolling green and gold down to the water where a dozen white sailboats had gathered, unbidden, just offshore, drawn by the spectacle of the city's most talked-about wedding of the season. The morning smelled like it always did in Charleston in April, jasmine and cut grass, and faintly, the brackish green of the river beyond the lawn. And the caterers had been setting up chairs since dawn, their voices carrying soft and businesslike across the water while the world woke up around them. Daniel had barely slept, not from nerves exactly, but from the particular electric wakefulness of standing at the edge of a day he'd spent 3 weeks quietly, carefully rewriting. Daniel stood in front of the mirror in the groom's cottage, in a cream linen suit that fit him like it had been made for the person he'd become rather than the person he'd started out as, which, in a way, it had, and thought about how strange it was to be nervous about a day whose ending he already knew. Except he didn't, not really, not anymore. The book had ended in humiliation and heartbreak on this exact lawn, at this exact hour, and Daniel had spent 3 weeks rewriting every page of it with his own 2 hands. And he had no idea, standing here now, exactly how the next few hours would unfold. That uncertainty, he realized, didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like freedom. A knock came at the door. William's best man, his cousin from the Savannah side of the family, a genuinely kind man named Thomas Ashford, 31, quiet and sharp-eyed, who Daniel had come to like enormously over the last 3 weeks, poked his head in. "He's asking for you," Thomas said, grinning. "Says it's bad luck to see the groom before the ceremony, and then immediately said he doesn't care and to send you over anyway." Daniel laughed and found William waiting in the garden behind the cottage, dressed in a charcoal suit that made his shoulders look absolutely unfair, his gray eyes bright with something Daniel hadn't seen on him even once in the pages of the book, uncomplicated joy. "You're not supposed to be here," Daniel said, crossing the grass to him. "I don't care about supposed to," William said, taking both his hands. "I wanted 5 minutes where it's just us, before it's the whole world watching, before your cousin tries whatever he's going to try." His thumb traced over Daniel's knuckles. I wanted to tell you, without an audience, that whatever happens today, whatever Charles does, whatever anyone says, I already know the truth. I chose it a week ago in my study, and I'm choosing it again right now. You. Just you. Daniel's eyes stung. You're going to make me cry before I even walk down the aisle. Good, William said, unrepentant, and kissed him softly, once careful not to smudge either of their carefully composed faces. I like knowing I can still do that to you. From the front lawn, a string quartet began to play. Thomas cleared his throat pointedly from the garden gate. William squeezed Daniel's hands once more and let go, and the two of them walked, separately, toward the moment the entire city of Charleston had been waiting 3 weeks to watch. The ceremony itself was, in Daniel's admittedly biased opinion, perfect. 200 guests sat in white folding chairs beneath the live oaks, the April light falling gold and dappled through Spanish moss, the Ashley River glinting silver beyond the lawn. Daniel walked down an aisle strewn with magnolia petals on the arm of the aunt who had raised him, and found William waiting at the end of it with an expression so openly, helplessly fond that Daniel heard actual gasps from the front row. They exchanged the replica rings, perfect copies, cubic zirconia catching the light exactly as brilliantly as the real stones would have, and Daniel, reciting vows he had helped write himself instead of borrowing from a script, found that every word came easily, because for once, in a life built out of borrowed pages, he wasn't reciting anyone's lines but his own. I didn't expect you, William said, when it was his turn, voice rough with an emotion he didn't bother hiding from 200 witnesses. I expected paperwork. I expected a merger with a person attached. And instead, I got someone who spilled wine on me at our first dinner and somehow made it the most honest moment of my entire year. I got someone braver than anyone gave him credit for, who chose to trust me with the truth even when trusting people has never once been easy for him. I don't deserve that kind of trust, but I promise you, every day for the rest of my life, I'm going to try to earn it. Daniel did cry then, openly, unbothered by the mascara he wasn't even wearing, and when the officiant finally said the words that made it official, William kissed him like the 200 guests, the string quartet, and the entire watching city of Charleston had simply ceased to exist. In the front row, Margaret Ashford dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief and did not, for once in her composed life, seem to care who saw her do it. The applause was thunderous. Somewhere in the third row, Charles Vane clapped along with everyone else, his smile a fraction too tight, his eyes flicking, again and again toward the reception tent where, Daniel knew, without having to look, a small antique box sat waiting on the gift table, empty of anything but velvet lining and expectation. The reception unfolded beneath a white tent strung with fairy lights, long farm tables laden with shrimp and grits and low country boil, a jazz trio easing the crowd through champagne toasts, and the slow gold hour of a Charleston evening. Daniel felt it coming before it happened. The particular quality of Charles's attention, sharpening across the tent like a hawk circling. He caught William's eye across the room, and William, mid-conversation with the museum director who'd flown in specially for the wedding, gave a small, steady nod. Ready. It happened during the toasts. Charles rose from his seat with a champagne flute in hand, tapping it gently for attention, his golden smile pitched at exactly the wattage that had, for 30 years, gotten him whatever he wanted from a room. I just wanted to say a few words, Charles began, about family, about the Whitfields and the Ashfords, and how proud I am to watch my cousin marry into such a remarkable applause. Daniel kept his face carefully neutral, watching his cousin build the stage he was about to fall off of. Danny's had a hard road, lost his parents young, grew up without much really, compared to the rest of us. A pause, calculated for sympathy. So it means the world to see him land somewhere safe, somewhere secure. He let that word, secure, sit in the air a beat too long. Then he turned, slowly, to the gift table, where the antique ring box sat displayed among the presents, lid propped open to show off its empty velvet interior to anyone who cared to look. Actually, Charles said, and here it came, here was the pivot Daniel had read 112 chapters ago and lived through in his own body 3 weeks of dread to reach. I couldn't help but notice, the ring box is empty. William, I know you two donated the family heirloom to the museum, very generous, very public-spirited of you both. His eyes found Daniel's, and something ugly gleamed there beneath the golden charm. But I have to ask, because I care about this family, and I'd hate for anyone to think, Is everything accounted for? Because I happened to notice, a few weeks back, some unusual activity. A pawn shop on King Street. I hate to bring it up on such a happy day, but... Charles, William's voice cut through the tent, calm, level, and utterly unmistakable in its authority. 200 guests fell silent. What exactly are you implying? Charles's smile faltered, just slightly, just for a heartbeat, before he pressed forward, committed now, unable to stop the momentum of a lie he'd spent a month building. I'm not implying anything, William. I would never. Are you suggesting, William said, stepping forward, that Daniel stole a ring? I only meant... A ring, William continued, voice never rising, never needing to. That you yourself watched us donate to the Charleston Maritime Museum 4 days ago. A ring that is, at this exact moment, sitting under climate-controlled glass a mile and a half from here, with a brass plaque bearing both our names. A ring that 3 museum board members, Charles, 2 of whom are sitting at that table right there, Charles, and can correct me if I'm wrong, personally witnessed us hand over. The museum director, to her credit, rose immediately from her seat. That's correct, she said, clear and carrying. The ring has been in the museum's permanent collection since Tuesday. I have the paperwork in my car if anyone needs confirmation. A murmur swept the tent, confusion curdling, fast, into something colder. Charles's face had gone from golden to gray in the space of 10 seconds, his eyes darting for an exit that didn't exist. Somewhere near the bar, a caterer froze mid-pour, champagne bottle tilted at an angle nobody was paying attention to anymore. There's also, William said, and here his voice finally sharpened, finally let a fraction of 6 weeks of controlled fury show through, the small matter of 3 withdrawals from your personal account to a pawn shop on King Street over the last month, Charles. And 2 calls you made to my family's insurer, asking detailed questions about the ring's appraisal value, under the pretense of planning a surprise. I have copies of both. I've had them for 2 weeks. William, I don't know what you think you... I think, William said, that you spent a month manufacturing evidence to convince 200 people that my husband is a thief on our wedding day in front of his family because you couldn't stand to watch him have something you decided you deserved instead. And I think you're about to find out exactly how much damage a lie does when it's got nothing real left to hide behind. Daniel had never, in either of his lives, seen a room go so completely, devastatingly silent. Charles stood there, champagne flute trembling in his hand, golden smile gone, every eye in the tent fixed on him with an expression that had curdled from confusion into something far less forgiving. Recognition. You planned this, Charles said, finally, voice cracking. You knew. We knew, Daniel said, rising from his seat, stepping up beside William, steady and unafraid, in a way the original Daniel Whitfield had never once been allowed to be in 112 chapters of quiet suffering. We knew for 3 weeks. We watched you build this, and we let you walk right up to the edge of it, in front of everyone, because I was done letting you write the story of who I am. Charles's aunt, Daniel's own aunt, who had raised him, stood slowly from her seat near the front, her face ashen with a mixture of horror and dawning, furious clarity. Charles Eliot Vane, she said, in a voice Daniel had only ever heard her use once, when he was 9 years old and had broken her favorite vase. You get in your car, and you leave this property, and you do not come back until you have found the decency to apologize to this family for what you just tried to do. Beside her, Margaret Ashford rose as well, unhurried, and said nothing at all, simply crossed the small distance to where Daniel stood, and rested one hand briefly, deliberately, on his shoulder, in front of every guest who had ever doubted where he belonged in this family. It was a small gesture. It was also, from a woman who had once ejected him from her dining room over a wine stain, the loudest possible statement she could have made. Charles looked around the tent one last time, at 200 faces that had, 30 seconds ago, adored him, now looking back with nothing but cold, clear-eyed disgust, and fled, champagne flute abandoned on the white tablecloth, golden charm burned entirely away, leaving nothing behind but the very plain, very undignified sight of a man caught in his own lie with absolutely nowhere left to hide it. The silence held for one more heartbeat. Then Thomas Ashford, from the back of the tent, raised his own champagne glass and said, dryly, "Well, I don't think anyone's going to forget this reception, and the whole tent, all 200 guests, still reeling, still recalibrating, burst into something between laughter and applause, the tension breaking like a fever, and the jazz trio, God bless them, picked that exact moment to strike back up. Conversations rekindled in scattered, disbelieving clusters up and down the long farm tables. "Did you see his face?" Someone murmured 2 seats down. "The museum director just stood right up," said someone else, delighted, like they'd witnessed a magic trick instead of a public unraveling. Waiters moved through the crowd, refilling glasses with a little extra flourish, sensing, correctly, that this particular reception had just become the story every guest would be telling at dinner parties for the next decade. William turned to Daniel, gray eyes soft despite the anger still simmering beneath the surface, and pulled him close, forehead resting against his. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," Daniel said, and found, to his own surprise, that it was completely true. "I'm free of him. Finally. In every way that matters." "Good," William murmured and kissed him, slow, unhurried, a promise instead of a spectacle, even with 200 people watching. "Because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to look over your shoulder at that man again." The story made the front page again on Monday. Not the style section this time, but a headline the Post and Courier's gossip columnist clearly relished writing. "Asford wedding scandal. Cousins alleged frame up exposed by museum donation, guests say." Charles Vane resigned from the Maritime Museum's board by Wednesday, quietly, without comment, and left Charleston entirely by the following month, his golden reputation reduced to hushed, scandalized dinner party conversation from Broad Street to Trad Street. Nobody in Charleston society, it turned out, was quite so forgiving of a man who'd tried to frame an innocent Omega out of pure, ugly envy in front of 200 witnesses and a museum's worth of paperwork. Daniel's aunt cried, properly this time, when she hugged him goodbye at the end of the reception. Not the calculating tears of family obligation, but real ones, the kind that came from finally, fully seeing the nephew she'd half-raised and never quite protected the way she should have. And Daniel and William married now properly, with a ring under museum glass that meant more to both of them, sitting in public trust than it ever would have hidden away in a velvet box. Daniel and William drove away from Ashford Landing that night in William's absurdly impractical vintage convertible, top down, the Ashley River turning silver-black behind them, Biscuit's enormous head hanging happily out the back window, and Daniel thought, watching the live oaks blur past in the dark, that he had finally, unshakably, found the one place he belonged, a feeling no book had ever managed to describe accurately enough to prepare him for it. "Regrets?" William asked, one hand on the wheel, the wind pulling at his collar, the other finding Daniel's across the console, the way it had found it 100 times these last 3 weeks, and would, Daniel suspected, find it 10,000 more times in the years to come. "Just one," Daniel said. William glanced over, brow furrowing. "I regret," Daniel said, grinning, "not spilling that wine on you sooner. Would have saved us both a lot of time." William laughed, that same startled, delighted sound from the hallway 3 weeks ago, except easier now, unguarded, entirely his, and lifted Daniel's hand to his mouth, pressing a kiss to his knuckles right there at a red light on Meeting Street, and Daniel thought, This is the ending I came here to write." The problem with marrying a man who owned a mastiff, Daniel had discovered over the past year, was that the mastiff considered the entire bed, all of it, every square inch, to be rightfully his, and had absolutely no interest in the opinions of the 2 humans who technically paid the mortgage. "He's doing it again," Daniel said, at 6:47 in the morning, flat on his back, with approximately 4 inches of mattress to his name, and 140 pounds of drooling dog pinning his legs in place. William said, not opening his eyes, entirely unbothered, one arm slung over Daniel's waist in a way that made it functionally impossible for Daniel to actually get up and address the biscuit situation even if he'd wanted to. "You're not going to help me." "No," William agreed, pulling him closer instead, mouth curving against the back of Daniel's neck. "It's Sunday. Sundays I get cream in my coffee and I don't move for anyone, dog included." "That's not a rule, that's just laziness." "It's a very sacred rule," William said, with the particular gravity of a man who ran a 4-port shipping empire on weekdays and refused, on principle, to make a single decision before 9 a.m. on his day off. "I built an entire company on discipline, Daniel. I'm allowed one day where the discipline takes a break." Daniel laughed and gave up and let himself be pinned between a mastiff and a husband, and thought that this ridiculous, warm, ordinary Sunday morning tangle of limbs and dog hair and the smell of coffee William hadn't gotten up to make yet was worth more to him than anything the original book had ever promised him. It had been a good year. William had folded him properly into the family business. Not as a figurehead, but genuinely funding a historic preservation initiative through the Ashford Foundation that let Daniel spend his days doing exactly what he loved, restoring the bones of old Charleston houses one hand-painted panel at a time. His aunt called every Sunday now, real calls, the kind with actual conversation in them instead of obligation. Thomas Ashford had become, somewhat to Daniel's surprise, one of his closest friends, prone to showing up unannounced with bourbon and terrible advice about houseplants. And Charles, well, Charles had resurfaced exactly once, 6 months ago, a stiff, badly written letter forwarded through a lawyer, an attempt at some kind of reconciliation that read more like damage control than remorse. Daniel had read it once, folded it up, and let it go, the way you let go of a book you'd already finished, with a little sadness for what could have been, and considerably more relief that it was, finally over. There had been other developments, smaller and sillier, that no book could have predicted. William, it turned out, was a wildly competitive Scrabble player who sulked for actual hours if Daniel beat him, which Daniel now did on purpose at least once a week, purely for the entertainment value of watching a man who ran 4 ports pout into his coffee. Daniel, in turn, had developed an entirely unreasonable habit of narrating Biscuit's inner thoughts in a low, gravelly voice. "I am the true master of this house. You are both simply staff." That made William laugh so hard once, over dinner, that he'd nearly choked on a shrimp, and Daniel had considered it, at the time, one of the finest achievements of his entire life. They had lost the regatta again this past spring, a full 7 minutes behind Thomas, who had taken to gloating with the theatrical flair of a man who understood exactly how much the win mattered to William's pride, and William had spent the drive home composing an elaborate, entirely serious revenge plan for next year's race that involved a sail configuration Daniel didn't understand a word of, delivered with the same intensity he brought to million-dollar shipping contracts. And Daniel had simply sat in the passenger seat and loved him, helplessly, for the sheer earnest ridiculousness of it. "You're thinking too loud," William murmured, eyes still closed. "I can feel it." "I'm thinking," Daniel said, "that I love you, obnoxiously, constantly, even with your dog's foot in my kidney." William cracked one eye open at that, gray and warm and utterly, helplessly fond, and pulled Daniel in properly, dog be damned, until they were tangled together the way they'd been that first Tuesday on the porch swing, except easier now, surer, worn smooth by a year of choosing each other, over and over, on ordinary mornings nobody was watching. "I love you too," William said. Obnoxiously. Constantly, a beat, his mouth curving against Daniel's hair, "even when you spill wine on me." That happened one time. Twice, actually. Our anniversary dinner. "That doesn't count. You startled me. You got down on one knee in the middle of a restaurant." "I'm allowed to propose to my own husband a second time," William said, entirely unrepentant, "if it means watching you turn that particular shade of red." Downstairs, the coffee maker beeped, ignored. Biscuit snored on, sprawled across the last available foot of mattress. They finally did get up, an hour and a half later than either of them would ever admit to Margaret, who had opinions about promptness that neither marriage nor mastiffs were permitted to override. William made the coffee, cream for himself, black for Daniel, a small domestic rebellion against the roles they'd started with, while Daniel stood at the kitchen window in one of William's old Henleys, watching the trad street garden wake up in the early light, camellias just beginning to drop their petals across the flagstones. "Thomas wants a rematch," William said, sliding a mug across the counter, entirely too pleased with himself. "Says he's got a new boat, faster hull. You're going to spend the next month designing a counterboat, aren't you?" "I already have 3 sketches. You have a job, William." "I have several jobs," William said with the wounded dignity of a man who ran 4 ports and still considered losing a charity regatta to his cousin a matter of genuine strategic importance. "Running a shipping empire has taught me that no threat is too small to plan for." Daniel laughed into his coffee, and William caught the sound like he always did, like it was something worth collecting, and crossed the kitchen to kiss the top of his head, unhurried, easy, the kind of casual affection that had once seemed impossible from the granite-jawed stranger at that first ruined dinner and now felt as natural as breathing. Later that afternoon, Daniel's aunt called, as she did every Sunday now, and asked, as she always did, whether he was happy. It had taken her the better part of a year to start asking that question and mean it, to stop assuming the answer and actually wait to hear it, and Daniel had come to treasure the pause on the line almost as much as the question itself. Ridiculously, Daniel told her, watching William out on the porch, sleeves rolled up, trying and failing to teach Biscuit to fetch a tennis ball the dog had clearly decided belonged to him now and always would. Obnoxiously happy. You'd be sick of hearing about it if you had to live here. I'd like to see that for myself sometime, his aunt said, warm and a little wistful, and they made plans for a Sunday dinner the following month, an easy, ordinary plan, the kind neither of them would have dared make a year ago. That evening, on the same porch swing that had once creaked under the weight of a confession neither of them had been ready to name, Daniel curled into William's side and watched the sky over the Ashley River go the color of the inside of a peach, and thought, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, that he had spent one lifetime reading about love from the outside, and this one, finally, actually living it, was infinitely better than any version he'd ever turned the pages of. "What are you thinking about?" William asked, quiet, his chin resting against Daniel's hair. "That I got the ending I wanted," Daniel said. "The real one, not the one somebody else wrote for me." William's arms tightened around him, unhurried and sure, and somewhere in the garden below, Biscuit finally, triumphantly, caught the tennis ball, and neither of them moved to celebrate it, too content exactly where they were. And Daniel Whitfield, reborn once, rewritten entirely by his own hand, loved exactly as thoroughly as he'd once only read about in the small hours of a life that felt impossibly far away now, let himself be held, and thought that some stories really did deserve the ending they'd been denied the first time around.